Hi everyone. So this is going to be our sort of makeup lecture for not having class on Thursday. I'm sure you were all very sad that we did not meet on Thursday. We have this one last slide of Module 2. We're still covering Chapter 3 in the Gillen book here on this slide. Um, and then we're going to go right into the beginning of Module 3, which starts with Chapter 4. Now, usually in class, I would show you a short documentary about this particular slide. So we'll start with that in class when I see you again next Thursday. So let's start here. The domestic Red Scare. So when we talk about the Red Scare, what we're really talking about is our fear of communism at home, right? Our fear that there are communists inside our country working in the government and are going to make policies that will make our government more communist. So it's related to the Cold War, of course, but it's not exactly the same thing as our fear of communism spreading abroad. We have an international policy to, our foreign policy of containment to try and keep that from happening. And then the Red Scare is our fear of communists at home in the United States. I want to mention the idea of the social contract. You don't need to write this down, but just to give you an idea of um, the way that Americans are thinking about this issue. The social contract is this idea that comes from political philosophy about how Americans or people in any country really give up certain rights to the government, and the government in turn will provide protection. So the easiest example to give is we don't have the right in America to kill someone else. It is illegal to murder someone. So we give up that right. The government is going to regulate that. And in in response to that, we are doing that because we want the government to help protect us from allowing people to walk around and murder each other, right? So there are some issues where it's pretty cut and dry. It should be illegal to murder someone, it should be illegal to steal, it should be illegal, to do those sorts of extreme things. And then there are cases where it gets really blurry, right? So should it be illegal for people to get an abortion? Should it be illegal for communists to serve in government? Should it be illegal for Americans to have access to marijuana? So those types of things are much more in that gray area. So how many rights are we as Americans collectively willing to give up to our government so that the government can then protect us and keep us from hurting each other? So that's the idea of the social contract. The people in a society are going to put their trust in the government so the government can protect them, and the way they do that is by giving up some rights. Now, the reason I bring that up is because this is going to be the real issue here. How many of our individual rights are we willing to give up to the government in the name of protecting us from communism? And today, in 2017, our question is really about um, applying that same issue to terrorism, right? How many of our individual rights are we willing to give up to the government to protect us from terrorism? So are we willing to go through all of those security measures at the airport? Are we willing to allow the government to listen in on our phone calls and read our emails and so on and so forth? So this is still a very relevant issue today. Now, the first thing that I want to mention in relation to the domestic Red Scare is HUAC. And HUAC is the House Un-American Activities Committee. And uh, I'll give you a second to write this. So what you want to write down for HUAC in answer to this question, who are they? It is a committee in Congress. So a committee in Congress that investigates potential communists at home. So a committee in Congress that investigates potential communists at home or in America. At home and in America is meaning the same thing here. So if you're not that familiar with the way Congress works, and if you're not, that's fine. Um, it's not always every day all of the members of Congress sitting together in one big room, having big discussions and taking votes. A lot of issues are first looked at and debated in committees. So there are tons of committees in Congress, and then those committees go back and they report things to um, the rest of the House and the Senate, and votes are taken, and a lot of issues are dealt with that way. And that's the way it works today. It's the way it's always worked. So it's a committee of congressmen who are going to have this job of investigating potential communists at home in the United States. Okay, and their purpose is to prevent communists from infiltrating American government and culture. I say culture because we're going to talk about Hollywood. So their purpose is to prevent communists from infiltrating American government and culture. If you're curious about dates, you don't need to memorize them, but this HUAC was actually created in 1938. So as before we're even getting into World War II, but as we're worried about looking abroad and seeing potential nations that could fall to communism, and the influence that might have in the United States. But HUAC is the most active in the years following World War II. So they're most active in the late 1940s into the 1950s, and it will be around until the late 1960s. All right, so now the loyalty review program, you want to highlight HUAC, and then you also want to highlight loyalty review program. So I'm going to give you a definition if you want to date this. This first came into existence in 1947. So the loyalty review program was, I'll give you a definition here. The Truman administration passes a law stating that all government employees So the Truman administration passes a law stating that all government employees must swear allegiance to the American government. So the Truman administration passes a law stating that all government employees must swear allegiance to the American government. So in other words, we have a president who is a Democrat, and remember I drew you that a couple of times. I've drawn on the board that line where we put Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right, and we show that communism is all the way to the left. And we talked about how Democrats want to show that even though they're on the left of the line, so closer to communism, closer to the ideas of socialism and communism, that they are distinctly not communist, and also that they are distinctly not socialist. And so as a Democrat, all Democratic presidents are going to get this accusation that they're socialists or that they're communists. And we see that even today. It was something that people said would have had said of President Obama when he was in office. It wasn't as big of a deal, with our current international issue. We're no longer in the Cold War, but it's still something that Democratic presidents will face and that they'll have to address. So the loyalty review program was really to make everyone who works in the government to promise that they are loyal to the American government, and to say that I'm not secretly a communist, or I don't hope that communism comes to the United States. And you could be fired if you were suspected of being a communist. And this part's important too, so I would maybe add that. You could be fired if you were suspected of being a communist. Now, one thing that you don't need to add here is that this loyalty review program was initially came out in the wording of this legislation stated that the person's behavior, you were suspected of being a communist based on behavior. Well, a little while later, this program is strengthened where it says that you can be suspected of being a communist based on your character. And if you remember, we had talked about the Lavender Scare. Many people will be fired from the government because they are assumed or known to be gay, and then therefore also assumed to be communist, and not because they're communist. So it's because they are gay that they are losing their jobs. And again, the assumption is if you're gay, you're a communist. So let me give you a definition of Red Scare, because I don't think you have it in your notes yet. I did mention it in class, but it's not. I don't think you have it written down. It's something you want to highlight as Red Scare. So it's this. It is the belief that all gays are also communists. And again, it sounds so crazy, so ridiculous, but the belief is that if you're gay, then you are too soft, and then you are susceptible to being blackmailed by someone who is a communist into doing things for a communist, or into turning into a communist. And so it does become this strangely political thing, this link between homosexuality and communism. I'll give you a minute to write this. So Joseph McCarthy, I didn't put it here, but if you're curious, he's a Republican. He's a senator from Wisconsin. He is not very well known until he is going to attend a meeting of, I think that it's called the Women's Republicans meeting, um, something along those lines. And he is going to just take this opportunity to make this accusation for which he has no proof. So what he says is, and this is what you want to write under accusations, he says he has a list of 205 known communists. So he has a list of 205 known communists currently working in the State Department. So he has a list of 205 known communists currently working in the State Department. And this is in 1950. So when I say known communists, what I mean is he's suggesting, as he says, I have in my hand a list of these people, the names. He knows who they are according to him, but this is fabricated, as we find out later. And the State Department, if you're not sure, is a government department that works with international affairs. So if you know that your next door neighbor who is a bus driver, for example, is a communist, then that might be scary because we're afraid of communists. But he probably isn't going to be making influential decisions in his job that could lead the American government into becoming more communist. But if you work at a government department that deals with international affairs and you're a communist, and he's saying that there are over 200 of them, then that's very scary for many people. It would be like saying today we have 205 people in the State Department who are sympathetic to terrorism or who have links to ISIS, right? That would be very scary. What we're going to end up getting, McCarthy gets a lot of press, a lot of attention for this. He's going to get initially a lot of support. Next week, I will show you, it might not be next week on Thursday, it might be the following week, but I'll show you sort of his downfall. He has a lot of attention for a few years, and then there are these televised hearings where people just lose their patience with him, and I'll show you a little clip of that. But for a couple of years, there are many people who find him truthful, who find his accusations scary and very serious, and so he has a lot of attention. for about 3 years. Now, there's a term that comes out of him. It's named for him and these accusations that he makes, and that's McCarthyism. And I'll give you a definition, and it is a communist witch hunt. So a communist witch hunt based on false accusations. So a communist witch hunt based on false accusations. In other words, saying you know all these people who are communists and you really don't, or maybe you just have some very tiny piece of potential evidence that this person is maybe a communist. And so you go all the way and say they're communists, they're working with international communism, and it scares people. Now, the Crucible, you don't need to add, I would highlight McCarthyism. You don't need to add anything for the Crucible, but I just want to mention, and I'm sure some of you have read it and some of you have seen the film. It's about the Salem witch trials, but and some of you, I'm sure, know this too. If you read it in high school, you probably talked about the context of when it was written. The Crucible was actually written during this time period in the United States where it was, yes, it's about the Salem witch trials where people are accusing all sorts of others in Salem, Massachusetts in the late 17th century of being witches and casting spells on them and so on and so forth. So it is about that, but its actual meaning more deeply is a social commentary on what is happening with the Red Scare. And so Arthur Miller, the author who himself had been accused of being a communist, he is stating that he is stating that if the United States continues to just accuse all of these people of being communist, then it's just as bad as if, you know, we were accusing people of being witches, that there's no real evidence and that it's destroying people's reputations, destroying their careers, destroying their lives. Now, the Rosenbergs, this is an example of one of the um, espionage cases. Your book talks about a few of them. It talks about the Rosenbergs, it talks about Alger Hiss. And essentially, the espionage cases is really just different people who are accused of being spies, Americans who had been turned by the communists and are spies or are accused of being spies for the Soviets and are passing informations to the Soviets, and they're high profile cases. So the Rosenbergs is one of those instances. Julius and Ethel, they are a married couple, and the accusation is that Julius Rosenberg had worked with Klaus Fuchs, who you don't need to write this, I'll just tell you about it. Klaus Fuchs had worked at Los Alamos, which had helped develop our atomic bomb that we had detonated, that we talked about at the end of World War I. And so the fear is that Julius Rosenberg was working with Klaus Fuchs to pass secrets about nuclear weapons on to the Soviets. And both Julius and Ethel, his wife, were accused and imprisoned and found guilty and executed. And today the general consensus, I believe, is that Klaus Fuchs was guilty. Julius was probably guilty, but his role was not as big as what was suggested during their trial. That his wife was most likely innocent, but that they accused her and sentenced her to try and get a confession out of her husband. There was a lot of press about it because they were Jewish and also because they were going to be executed, which is, you know, of course, much worse than just being imprisoned. So there were protests all over the world and, you know, here in America, of course, to try and keep the execution from happening, but it goes forward. The execution is in 1953, and the judge who sentences them in the case, in their court case, is going to actually blame them for the Korean War, which is, you know, essentially suggesting that because you pass these secrets and the Soviets developed their bomb faster, and you know we wouldn't be in this mess in Korea if it wasn't for you, type of thing. And so these espionage cases where the Rosenbergs is an example is they're going to get a lot of press and they're going to again spread fear in America. People are going to think anybody can be a communist. My kid's teacher could be a communist, secretly spreading communist ideas onto the children, or the guy at the grocery store could be a communist. I mean, there's always that fear. And then the Hollywood 10 is going to reference a group of writers and directors in Hollywood. I'll give you a minute to write this. And this number one part here, subversive messages from Hollywood, essentially people start to fear, and again, you'll see this on the documentary that I'm going to show you when we meet again next Thursday. People start to fear that Hollywood, which is influential, it makes lots of movies, people go see these movies, that it might have some subversive messages that are subconsciously, people are subconsciously starting to take in communist ideas or communist leanings through these films that Hollywood is putting out. And so these writers and directors are called to testify in front of HUAC, and there are 10 of them, or actors as well, who appear. When we get to Ronald Reagan at the end of the semester, he had been a famous actor. He is actually going to testify as a friendly witness, and then will later become an informant for the FBI. He's vehemently anti-communist, as we'll see. But there are 10 of these writers and directors who don't answer the questions, and they say that it is their constitutional right not to answer these questions, and they are held in contempt of Congress, and many of them are fined or imprisoned for a year, and then they're actually blacklisted, so they can't get work after that in Hollywood. Okay, so that's the end of that. Let's go to Module 3. And Module 3 is going to begin with Chapter 4 in the Gillen text. And Chapter 4, the way this particular module is set up is these 3 chapters cover roughly the same time period. So Chapters 4, Chapter 5, and Chapter 6, they are going to cover society and politics from the post-war era up until the early 1960s. So what we're going to be seeing here is Chapter 4 is about the ideals of society. How did people expect their society to be? How did they want their society to be? Chapter 5 is about the politics of the 50s. So it's about, instead of Chapter 4 being about expectations about culture in the 50s, mostly the 50s, Chapter 5 is about politics in the 50s, the Eisenhower administration. And then Chapter 6 is going to be the realities of the post-war era. So what are the ways in which the things we talked about in Chapter 4, these ideals that society holds, that all women should be at home, that whites and blacks should be separated, those types of things. What are the ways in which these ideas are not actually true or are being challenged in this time period? So that's the way that your book sets up these this particular time period. Now, Chapter 4 begins with talking about the kitchen debate, and it mentions Nikita Khrushchev, but you haven't yet been introduced to who he is. So I just have this first slide here so that you will be familiar with this change in leadership in the Soviet Union. Stalin dies in 1953, and when he dies, there are 3 men in the Soviet Union who are sort of vying for power. In other words, these three men are going to try and take over leadership of the Soviet Union, take over Stalin's place. And for a few years, they will sort of lead together, and this is called the Troika. But by 1958, Nikita Khrushchev is going to have emerged as the official new leader of the Soviet Union. So far we've talked about Vladimir Lenin, and then we talked about Joseph Stalin, and now this next leader that we're discussing is Nikita Khrushchev. And again, when you're studying for your exams for this class, just look at your notes and look in your book if you want to see what you need to know about these people. If you put these guys in Google, you are going to get so much more information than you need. And a lot of it will probably be correct, some of it will not be correct. So if you look in your notes and then you go to the book and you still have questions or you're still not sure about what to know, please let me know. I'm happy to direct you. Okay, so Khrushchev is going to be the next leader of the Soviet Union by 1958. Here's a picture of him. And he's going to advocate a policy called de-Stalinization. And I'm going to give you a definition for this, and you want to highlight it. So de-Stalinization is it is Khrushchev advocating a, quote, peaceful coexistence, unquote. So Khrushchev is advocating a peaceful coexistence with the United States. So in other words, Stalin, who was a bit more heavy-handed, maybe we could say, in his relationship with the US, with the way he treated his own people, is very barbaric in many ways. He's, like we said, responsible for the deaths of around 20 million people, perhaps. It's difficult to know exact figures. Khrushchev will not be so harsh on his own people, and he wants to advocate a more peaceful coexistence with the Americans. He's also going to try to further industrialize the Soviet Union. Again, recognizing that this can increase the Soviet Union's power, increase their position in the world. I'm going to give you a minute to write this, and then I'll talk about it. All right. The post-war era, which if you want dates for that, when I say post-war era, I'm really referring to post-World War II, at least, for this time period here. In the post-war era, we see people really investing in stuff, all sorts of stuff. Consumer goods, houses, cars, so many things are being purchased, and this is very helpful for our economy. We see an economic boom in this time period. So we're going to see a rise. Consumerism is characterized by this rise in income. People are making more money in general. A rise in spending, so they're making more money and they're spending more money. This is where we start to see the emergence of credit cards. I tell my students in my early American history class, when we talk about colonial America, that Americans are actually always in debt. There's this argument, it's interesting, but there's this argument that one of the reasons so many people were willing to split from Great Britain in 1776 was because they were in this perpetual debt to creditors in London. So you might, be a wealthy plantation owner over here in the colonies and have an agent over in London and say, any new books that come out on this topic, purchase it for me and put it on my tab and I'll owe you. Or my wife really likes dresses like this from Paris, so, purchase those for me and send them over. Silverware, send it over and I'll pay you. And it is interesting. A lot of the founding fathers were in large amounts of debt. Thomas Jefferson started the Library of Congress because he had a huge book collection that he then sold and tried to help get himself out of debt and then just purchased more and more books. So Americans have always been in debt. It's just this means of accumulating debt and credit cards uh, arrives in this time period. Advertising. There is advertising everywhere, and I want to show you this series of uh, ads that are directed at women in a very particular way, about women being the ones who purchase things for the family. So Christmas morning, she'll be happier with a Hoover, a vacuum cleaner, right? So this woman, see how happy she's portrayed on Christmas morning that she gets an appliance for Christmas. Wives, look this ad over carefully. Circle the items you want for Christmas. Show it to your husband. If he does not go to the store immediately, cry a little. Not a lot, just a little. He'll go, he'll go. And then at the bottom, husbands, look this ad over carefully. Pick out what your wife wants. Go buy it before she starts to cry. Again, suggesting that women are their happiest when their home lives are easiest, and that's the thing that will make them the most satisfied. And so please make sure that your wife has all of the newest appliances so that she has an easier time with all the chores at home. This one is a little crazy. If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for fresher coffee, if he discovers you're still taking chances on getting flat stale coffee, woe be unto you. For today, there's a sure and certain way to test for freshness before you buy. So this husband is punishing his wife like a child for not making the best choices in coffee. Darling, don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer. Again, sort of treating her like a child. Um, she's expected to be a good cook and she's not, but it's okay because this beer is good. Men are better than women. Indoors, women are useful, even pleasant. On a mountain, they are something of a drag. So don't go hauling them up a cliff just to show off your new sweaters. No need to. These pullovers look great anywhere. And then here's this depiction showing that the woman is not very good at climbing up the mountain, although I'm not sure why her husband is just leaving her down there. So you see advertising everywhere, and this advertising is aimed almost exclusively at the women, or as you saw, even when it's aimed at the men. So men, you don't have to wear these sweaters, you don't have to take your wife on a mountain to show off your sweater, or men, go get this before your wife cries. It's really about the way that the men are making purchases um, to help their wives or impress their wives or so on and so forth. So all of this advertising is going to really play on this expectation that we're going to see and have notes on, that women belong in the home, that they're supposed to be at home with the children, and the men go off to work and they make the important decisions, and the women take care of the kids and manage the household finances and keep the house clean. Okay, so justifications for spending. So this is a generation that was, born during the years of the Depression, or more likely born during the years or just after World War II. People are going to have children quite young in this era. So if you're born in 1945, when the war is over, then in 1962 you'll be 17, and there's a chance that you'll be getting married then or in the next year or two. So we're really looking at this generation of people who either had parents who suffered during the Depression or who remember the Depression. So this idea of just spending on all sorts of things and not saving as much is scary to people who remember that time period. So when you look at people who remember the Depression years, they're nervous. So that's what I mean here. So justifications for spending versus the Depression years. What I mean, and you don't have to write this in your notes, but what I mean is that people who experience the Depression really are hesitant to spend a lot of money on consumer goods. They worry that they need to save in case something happens again. There is what's referred to as pent-up demand, and I'll explain and then I'll give you a definition for your notes. Essentially, what this is suggesting is that one of the reasons why people became so willing to buy so much stuff in the post-war era is because they put purchasing on hold during the Depression and even in a lot of ways during World War II. So people are saving, or they don't have jobs so they can't save, and then the war starts and you have to ration and you have to prepare for when the men come home. And so people weren't really able to purchase things that they may have wanted or that could make their lives easier for about a decade and a half. So by the time you get this World War II being over and the economy is doing well, there's this flood on the market of all sorts of new things, and now people have the money to buy it. So this demand had been there during all that time, but people were too nervous to spend money. They might think a vacuum cleaner would make my life so much easier, but I can't go buy one because my husband is out of work or my husband is overseas or that type of thing. Oh, let me give you a definition for pent-up demand. I would say in the post-war era, people are purchasing all sorts of goods that they did not purchase during the Depression and World War II. So in the post-war era, people are purchasing all sorts of goods that they did not purchase during the Depression and the post-war era. So now that they had waited all this time, now the economy looks good, our country looks stable, the world looks more stable, so they feel safer spending money. Virtuous consumerism. So this I would highlight, and what you want to write here, and it might sound kind of silly, but this is actually the way that people viewed things, even if not consciously, maybe sometimes more subconsciously. This is the belief that spending money on consumer goods, so the belief that spending money on consumer goods supports capitalism and proves capitalism works better than communism. So spending money on consumer goods supports capitalism and proves that capitalism is better than communism, right? I mean, think about it. If you are trying to support your country's government and position in the world as a capitalist democracy, then just going out and purchasing stuff at the store, purchasing a vacuum cleaner, purchasing a television, purchasing a new car, even, shows that in America, you have a job, you work hard, you get paid, you come home, you get to use that money however you want, you go out and spend it, and the economy is doing well. And so it shows these fruits of capitalism, how it works well in the United States. So it has that interesting political undertone to it. Now, in 1944, there was a survey done where people went out and asked the public, members of the public, what are you looking forward to buying most when the war is over? Right? Because people are excited to buy more things once the war is over, and they're listed here in order. The first thing that they are most excited to, you don't write this down, this is just interesting. The first thing they're excited to purchase is washing machines, followed by electric irons, refrigerators, stoves, toasters, radios, vacuum cleaners, electric fans, and hot water heaters. And those are in order. So it's kind of interesting. People are excited for the war to be over, of course, because their family members would come home and things would be safer in the world, but also because now they can purchase all of these things. They feel more comfortable spending money. Okay, I'll give you a minute to write this. So in the post-war era, we see um, this 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 expectation of women. So when I say remember World War II women, remember that a lot of them had worked in the factories. We have that idea of Rosie the Riveter, and many of them had taken jobs while their husbands were gone, and they were not they were not doing this because they were feminists who wanted to have a career. The post-war expectation is really that all of these women who had gone to work and taken up jobs during the war would quit their jobs um, voluntarily. They would leave on their own and get married, or if they were already married, they would be happy their husband had returned, and they would be happy housewives. That they would prefer to be in the home, which is sort of their era of area of expertise, I suppose. So after the war is over, the expectation is that women will stop working and go home and be happy housewives. In addition to that, if a woman still wanted to work, um, there was always this severe fear that daycare was bad for children. And actually, this is still a debate today, but not to the extent that it was back then, because there's been a lot of research done on this issue. But people would think, even if a woman wanted to work, they would think, well, what are you going to do with your children? You can't put them in daycare, type of thing. Now, speaking of children, in the post-war era, we are going to have what is referred to as the baby boom. And the years for this are mostly understood to be 1946 to 1964. So it's babies born, children born 1946 to 1964. And you probably don't need a definition for a baby boom, but just in case you do, what you can write in your notes is a surge in the number of babies born in this era. So a surge in the number of babies born in this era. Now, the factors that go into creating this huge surge in babies, and the baby boomers today are retired, and they are mostly retired, not all retired, but today they're a generation that is so large that we talk about a lot in regards to their access to healthcare or Social Security and things like that. So this large generation is now becoming elderly. So what strain will or won't that put on our government programs that are meant to help the elderly, right? So you still do hear a lot about this, and my parents are of the baby boomer generation. A lot of your parents might be of the baby boomer generation. So, what is it that creates this baby boom? Well, one factor is delayed marriages. The number of people getting married went down during the Depression and during World War II, but when men came home from the war, a lot of marriages happened quickly, right? So, delayed marriages, which now happen in 1945, are going to produce children that start to be born in large numbers in 1946. Additionally, there's something called a procreation ethic. You don't have to write a definition for this, but just to think about or keep in the back of your mind that in a lot of ways, everywhere you looked in this time period, you saw different areas of your life suggesting or nudging you to have a large family. So I showed you those advertisements. They're all over the place. When a company wants to sell something, they're going to market it very strongly to married couples. Your life will be much easier with a vacuum because you have 4 kids and they take up a lot of your time. So vacuum cleaner will help you clean more quickly. Or, um, Coke is great for kids for a snack or great for dinner or whatever. So everywhere you look in advertisements, you see companies marketing towards families. The government is going to advocate that parents have children. There's not going to be easy access to things like birth control. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 6, so a little later in this module. So the government is going to advocate, even having large families. J. Edgar Hoover, who's the head of the FBI, is going to suggest that mothers having parents having children and mothers staying home with their children is going to help keep them from becoming communists and so on and so forth. When you watch sitcoms, I'll show you a short excerpt from Leave It to Beaver, which is a common sitcom of the 1950s. Sitcoms are really going to focus on happy white families in the suburbs with um, not not very serious problems. So everywhere you look, you see this push to have a large family, and that is what will make you happy. I mentioned a moment ago that there's a lack of birth control. Okay, so not only is abortion not legal, but when things like the birth control pill becomes available, it will not. Um, it will be legal for some time for a doctor just to say to a woman, "No, I will not prescribe you that because you should not be using birth control. You should want to have children." And optimism. People are tend to be optimistic about the future. They feel like this is a good, safe time to have kids. And then finally, modern science. So, and again, you don't have to really add any notes to this these factors down here, but modern science is going to create things like new vaccinations that will help children contract things like polio in a much lower rate, or penicillin, which will come on the market in the 1940s. It's going to, these developments in modern science will lower the child mortality rate significantly. So in other words, less babies will die, more children will live in you know, in higher rates than before. I have these two charts. There's this book that I used a lot in writing this lecture for my images and things, called Homeward Bound. Not like the movie with the animals, but it's a book written by Elaine Tyler May. It's a very interesting book if you find this topic interesting. But these two charts here show you, table one shows you median age at first marriage. And if you look, the trend for both men and women was actually that starting in 1890, people were getting married younger, younger, younger. And then you see this pretty low dip during the post-war era. And then around 1970, the age of average marriage goes up pretty significantly. And then down below, you see this trend where women are having less children over this period of time. So less children, less children, less children, less children. And then when you look at that post-war era, you see this spike. So all of a sudden, women are having more children. And then it drops off. And the year that it drops off is really around the year of Roe versus Wade, which makes abortion legal, and then stagnates after that. So what's interesting about the 1950s, and something I'll mention a couple times during Module 4's lecture, is that we have this weird thought process in America about how the 1950s was the way it always was. We look back with this nostalgia of things were, it was a simpler time, people were happy, um, there weren't so many pressures, and in some ways I can see where that's true. You know, there's no computers, there's not social media, you know, expectations about, you know, schooling, I suppose, and you know, wanting to get master's degrees and things like that are not as high. But at the same time, um, in a lot of ways, the 1950s is an anomaly. It was very different from the generation that came before it and the generation that comes after it. So when you look at the 1950s and you see things like all the women would be happiest if they stayed in the home, they started preparing for marriage when they were 14 or whatever. This is actually not the way it always was. This is a reversal of trends that had been happening um, in the previous generation. So this is the last slide we'll cover in this online lecture. Um, and, you know, again, like I said, when we come back on Thursday, because I don't see you on Tuesday for your short break, we will start with just reviewing these slides really quickly and, you know, seeing if you have any questions. And this lecture will stay up the duration of the semester. So if you feel like you want to go back and review it before exams, please feel free. And I'll show you the documentary. Pardon me, on the domestic Red Scare. Okay, so let me, for a minute, give you just a brief background on suburbia prior to the post-war era. So suburbia was not brand new after World War II was over. The idea of having suburbs actually started in the 19th century, so around the late 1800s. And you do not need to write this; it's prior to the time period of our class. But basically, the idea was that people had lived in the cities who, worked in the factories that were in the cities, and there was not a lot of access to public transportation yet. You start to get that around the year 1900, but certainly it's not anywhere near what it will be, a few decades later. So if you worked in the factories or worked somewhere in the city, the best thing to do is live in the city. But then as people start to advocate for workers' rights and things like that, there are like strikes in the cities near the factories, and parts of the cities are going to become more dangerous. Additionally, in general, cities were crowded, often overcrowded, they were dirty, they were smelly, um, and they were just, in a lot of ways, not enjoyable places to live. So the idea was that some wealthier individuals started to move to nice homes in locations right outside the city. So they would feel safer, they would have more space, their place could be cleaner. So the idea of suburbia was not created with the end of World War II, but it is significantly expanded after World War II is over. And the one of the first and the sort of prototype of the post-war suburbias is going to be a place called Levittown. Levittown is on Long Island, and Levittown is going to be a series of standardized homes. So in other words, everything sort of looks the same in these houses, and I'll show you in a minute. I'll show you um, an excerpt from a magazine. Now, um, when we look at suburbanization in general, the cost of purchasing a small home in the suburbs is actually going to be, in some cases, cheaper than renting a place in the cities. I think I may have told you you could buy a two-bedroom house in Levittown starting at $8,000, which adjusted for inflation, of course, would be more than $8,000 today, but still that's a good price. Um, the layout of these homes are going to promote family togetherness. So let me show you that magazine. Um, I'm hoping you can see it okay on your screen. You won't be able to read the text, but if you look at the 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 picture, the centerfold at the bottom of this slide, this was a cover story in a magazine. The magazine was called Look, and this is from 1943. And this is this idea about these new homes that are going to start popping up as the war is starting to come to an end, and then just boom after the war in the post-war years. And so this home is built in a way that will maximize the amount of time that all the family members can spend together. So you see the father sitting in the chair, and the children are sitting in another chair, and the wife in the living room. And then the wife is making dinner. She's setting the table over in the living room, but these rooms are all connected near each other so that you can spend a lot of time together, and the wife can be setting the table and still spend time with her husband and the children. And if you look up in the left, you see the picture of the kitchen, or the drawing of the kitchen, I should say. And there's a lot going on here, right? So you see this woman who is dressed in a nice dress with her hair done and high heels as she's cooking dinner, and you know that most likely she doesn't work. She dresses that way so that she looks nice when her husband comes home. And it's hard to tell on this small screen, but all of this space, these kitchen counters, are meant to have room for new appliances that are coming out for kitchens in this time period. So toasters and so on and so forth. And they're all labeled, actually. You can't see it. Um, and so the idea, and then there's the last picture down below is of the master bedroom and the bathroom and the closet. So the wife is getting ready at her vanity, and the father, the husband, is um, we can assume he's getting ready for work, picking out his clothes. So if you look at these drawings, you can see that these homes were designed in a particular way. And additionally, you probably can't read it, but in this bottom picture, the bottom right is going to show you these three diagrams of the way the houses are put together, and it says 10 workmen can assemble this quote prefab home in a day. Basically meaning that because they're standardized, just a crew of guys can come and put this house together very quickly. And again, it's designed with this family togetherness in mind. And in addition, more people need more space because their families are growing because of the baby boom. Finally, suburbanization, just like consumerism in general, is going to suggest that capitalism is great. And I would highlight this D here. Suburbanization is a symbol of the benefits of capitalism. In other words, it doesn't matter if you are a worker without a college diploma, if you have a high school degree and you work in a factory, that job that capitalism has created for you, you work for an independent factory, you don't work for a government factory, and you get to take home your salary, you take home your money, and you can use that to purchase a home. So anyone ideally in America could afford to purchase a home in this time period, which shows that capitalism is great, is the basic idea. I wanted to put up this picture. This is a picture of one of these homes. My parents actually lived in one like this. They have since sold their house, but some of you may have grown up in homes that were built in the 50s. All right, I'll just talk about these couple of things here that are at the bottom of the slide. The downside of suburbia, things that these were not talked about much in the 50s, but in the 60s, people will talk about them a lot. One is many women felt isolated. They felt like almost sort of prisoners in their own homes, or they got married at 17 and had four children by the time they were 25. And, um, so by the time they're 30, their children are all off to school and their husbands are at work and they are bored and they feel unfulfilled with their daily lives. And I don't want to give you the impression that this is every woman, but it we will see that it turns out that it was a common sentiment. Many women felt this way. They felt isolated in their little suburban homes. Discrimination, it was very common to be told you would not be able to purchase a house in suburbia if you were black. So sorry, I'm not selling you a house because you're not white. It happened a lot. And again, this doesn't become a huge issue initially, and we'll see that there will be pushback against this by the 60s. And then finally, this shift from ethnicity to white, I just want to mention here is that, and you don't need to write this down, but for a long time in America, we didn't view race the way that we view it now. Um, Early on, people's race was really what we would call today ethnicity. So, the Irish were considered a different race, the Italians were considered a different race, and they were looked down upon. And so, when you have cities, when you have people living in huge numbers in cities, you often have what are referred to as ghettos in the actual definition of the term. It's since evolved. I know we talked about this when we discussed the Jews in Germany, but a ghetto is basically an ethnic urban enclave. So it's a part of a city where people from a certain country would live. So New York City would have, or Chicago, or whatever. Even smaller cities like Buffalo, Syracuse, where my parents live, is like this. They have still remnants of the Italian part of the city, or the Irish part of the city, or the Polish part of the city. When you came over from as an immigrant in the year 1900 or whenever, and you were from a particular country, when you arrived in a city, you often tried to find the part of the city where people from your country lived. Why? Because they would speak the same language as you. They would have a church where you could worship that was in your language and was the same religion you were, like most likely. People would feel this sort of kinship to you, even if you weren't officially related. They might help you find a place to live, might help you find a job. So for a long time, people identified themselves by their ethnicity. I'm an Italian American, I'm an Irish American, so on and so forth. They didn't start really saying white until we saw this huge mass movement to the suburbs. And this is where people, instead of living in an area in a city where, you're Irish and you live in the Irish part of town, now you just live in the suburbs with other white Americans. And that's where we really start to get this definition or um, uh, this identification that people will have as being white as opposed to black or Asian or Native American or Hispanic, mostly as opposed to black in this time period. Um, okay, so that is what I have for you for now. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me, and we will briefly review these slides when we come back on Thursday, so you can always ask questions then as well. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend.